Captain Sarah Chun floated in the zero-gravity command center of the U.S. Thunderstrike, her fingers dancing across holographic displays as she monitored the deep space patrol route. The massive dreadnought cut through the void like a predator stalking its prey, its hull bristling with weapons that could crack moons in half. Around her, the bridge crew worked with the quiet efficiency that had made humanity feared across 3-star systems. The peace was shattered by Lieutenant Rodriguez's sharp intake of breath. "Captain, we're picking up a distress signal. It's not human." Sarah's dark eyes narrowed as she pushed herself toward the communications station. In the 2 decades since humanity had burst into galactic civilization like a wildfire, they had learned that alien distress calls usually meant one of 2 things: a trap or genuine terror. Both scenarios typically ended with someone getting hurt. "Put it through," she ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen too many battlefields. The bridge speakers crackled to life with a transmission that made hardened space marines flinch. The alien voice was high-pitched, desperate, speaking in broken, standard galactic. "Please, anyone. The hegemony. They came without warning. Our children. Our families. Please help us." Static consumed the signal, but not before they heard something that made Sarah's blood run cold. The unmistakable sound of plasma weapons firing in the background, followed by screams that needed no translation. "Sir, I'm reading massive energy signatures from the source system," reported Ensign Park from the sensor station. "Multiple capital ships, definitely hegemony design. They're bombarding the planet's surface." Sarah's jaw tightened. The galactic hegemony was humanity's oldest enemy, a collection of species that believed in their divine right to rule the galaxy. They saw humans as dangerous upstarts, barely evolved primates who had stolen technology they didn't deserve. The feeling was mutual, though humans expressed their displeasure with considerably more firepower. "Ma'am, regulations state we should report this to command and await orders," said Commander Hayes, her first officer. He was technically correct, but Sarah could see in his eyes that he already knew what her decision would be. She turned to face her crew, noting how they all watched her with expectant faces. These were Deathworlders, humans who had evolved on a planet so hostile that most aliens considered it uninhabitable. They had crawled their way up from the bottom of the food chain through sheer stubborn determination and an alarming willingness to fight anything that threatened them or those under their protection. "How far are we from the source?" Sarah asked. 16 hours at maximum burn," replied the navigator. "And how long before a proper fleet can respond?" "At least 3 days. Assuming command approves the operation immediately." Sarah nodded slowly. 3 days was an eternity when civilians were dying. She had seen what the hegemony did to planets that resisted them. The lucky ones were simply glassed from orbit. The unlucky ones faced systematic extermination that could take weeks. "Send a coded burst to command. Tell them we're investigating a possible hegemony incursion and request immediate reinforcement." She paused, making eye contact with each of her senior officers. "Then, signal the rest of the squadron. Tell them we're going in hot." The bridge erupted into controlled chaos as her crew began preparations for combat. The Thunderstrike was the flagship of the 7th Deep Strike Squadron, 5 ships that had earned their reputation in blood during the Centauri campaign. They were designed for one purpose: to hit enemy forces hard and fast, usually when they least expected it. "Ma'am, if I may," Commander Hayes said quietly, moving to stand beside her command chair. "This could be a trap. The hegemony knows how humans respond to distress calls." Sarah's smile was cold enough to frost the air recyclers. "Let them try. We'll show them what happens when they underestimate Deathworlders." As the squadron changed course and began accelerating toward the unknown system, Sarah found herself thinking about the first time she had heard an alien describe humans as Deathworlders. It had been during a diplomatic function early in her career, back when humans still tried to play nice with the galactic community. An ambassador from the ethereal collective had whispered the term to his companion, not realizing that humans had enhanced hearing. At the time, it had seemed like an insult. Now, Sarah wore it like a badge of honor. Humans had earned their reputation through countless battles where they refused to surrender, refused to retreat, and refused to accept defeat. They fought with a fury that other species found incomprehensible, protecting not just their own but anyone who called for help. Captain, we're receiving additional transmissions, Lieutenant Rodriguez reported. Multiple ships in distress, civilian transports by the sound of it. They're being hunted. The bridge fell silent except for the hum of the ship's massive engines. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, remembering her oath as a fleet officer. Protect the innocent. Defend the weak. Bring the fight to those who would prey on others. Time to intercept? She asked. 15 hours, 37 minutes at current acceleration. Not fast enough. Sarah turned to her engineering officer. Chief Martinez, I need everything the engines can give us. And I mean everything. The grizzled veteran grinned, his scarred face lighting up with anticipation. You want me to redline them, Captain? I want you to make them scream. Within minutes, the Thunderstrike was pushing beyond its rated specifications, its hull groaning under the stress of extreme acceleration. Behind it, the other ships of the squadron matched pace, their crews strapped in as they hurtled through space toward an unknown enemy. Sarah settled into her command chair and began reviewing everything they knew about the target system. It was called Refuge in the local star charts, home to a peaceful species known as the Kythera. They were herbivores, philosophers, and artists who had never developed weapons more sophisticated than farming tools. The perfect victims for the hegemony's expansion. But they had made one critical mistake. They had sent their distress call on frequencies they knew humans monitored. The hours passed in tense preparation. Weapons were charged and tested. Marines checked their equipment. Pilots ran final diagnostics on their fighters. Everyone knew what they were flying into, and everyone volunteered to be there. Captain, we're beginning to receive real-time sensor data from the system, announced the sensor operator. I'm reading 7 hegemony heavy cruisers in orbit around the 4th planet. They appear to be conducting orbital bombardment operations. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. 7 heavy cruisers against her 5 ships. Under normal circumstances, it would be considered a suicide mission. But these weren't normal circumstances, and her squadron wasn't made up of normal beings. Any sign of surviving civilian vessels? Picking up scattered life pods, and at least 3 ships trying to reach the outer system. The hegemony forces have deployed fighters to hunt them down. ETA to engagement range. 47 minutes. Sarah activated the ship-wide communication system. Her voice echoed through every corridor, every compartment, reaching the ears of over 3,000 human warriors who had chosen to stand between predators and prey. This is the captain speaking. In less than an hour, we're going to engage superior enemy forces in defense of innocent civilians. The enemy thinks they can slaughter peaceful beings while we stand by and watch. They think humans are just another species to be conquered or eliminated. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. They're about to learn why the galaxy calls us Deathworlders. The response was immediate and savage. Throughout the ship, humans roared their approval, their voices combining into a sound that would have terrified most species. It was the war cry of apex predators who had spent millions of years fighting their way to the top of the food chain, and who had no intention of giving up that position. As the squadron raced toward battle, Sarah allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. The hegemony had made a fatal error in judgment. They had forgotten the most important rule about dealing with humans: never threaten something they had chosen to protect. The hegemony fleet hung in orbit around Refuge like vultures circling wounded prey. Admiral Zektar of the Draconian Imperial Navy stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching with cold satisfaction as his forces systematically destroyed everything that could support life on the planet below. The primitive Kythera had been foolish enough to refuse hegemony protection. Now they would serve as an example to other worlds that might harbor similar delusions of independence. Admiral, our fighters report successful interception of 2 more civilian transports, announced his tactical officer, a reptilian draconian whose scales flickered with pleasure. The remaining ships have fled beyond the system's edge. Zektar nodded approvingly. The operation was proceeding exactly as planned. Total pacification of the system would be complete within 6 hours, after which they could begin strip mining the planet's valuable resources. The Kythera's crystal cities would make excellent construction material for new hegemony fortifications. Sir, we're detecting hyperspace distortions at the edge of the system, reported the sensor operator. 5 ships dropping out of FTL. Configuration unknown. The Admiral's interest was piqued, but not concerned. Probably another group of refugees, or perhaps a small trade convoy that had wandered into the system by accident. Either way, they would be dealt with quickly and efficiently. "Display them on screen," he ordered. The main viewer shifted to show 5 ships emerging from hyperspace in a formation that immediately set off alarm bells in every tactical officer's mind. These weren't merchant vessels or refugee ships. They moved with predatory grace, their hulls angular and aggressive, bristling with weapon emplacements that spoke of serious military hardware. "Admiral," the tactical officer said, his voice suddenly uncertain. "Those ships, they matched known configurations from human space." A chill ran down Zektar's spine. Humans, the one species in the galaxy that even the mighty hegemony approached with caution. They had learned to respect human military capabilities during a series of border skirmishes that had cost the hegemony 3 entire fleets, and achieved exactly nothing except proving that humans would fight to the last ship rather than surrender. "What is a human squadron doing in this system?" Zektar demanded. Before anyone could answer, the communications station chirped with an incoming transmission. The Admiral gestured for it to be put through, expecting some form of diplomatic protest or demand for withdrawal. Instead, he found himself looking at a human female with dark eyes that seemed to burn with inner fire. Her uniform was crisp and professional, but there was something in her expression that reminded him uncomfortably of a hunting predator. "I am Captain Sarah Chun of the United Earth ship Thunderstrike," she said, her voice carrying across the bridge with icy formality. "You are hereby ordered to cease all military operations against the civilian population of this system and withdraw immediately." The bridge fell silent. Several of Zektar's officers exchanged nervous glances. The Admiral felt his own intimidation rising, but fought it down. He commanded 7 heavy cruisers against 5 human ships. The mathematics were in his favor. "Captain Chun," he replied, allowing condescension to color his voice. "This system is under hegemony jurisdiction. Your presence here is illegal. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences." The human smile was absolutely terrifying. "Admiral, I'm going to explain something to you about human military doctrine. When we receive a distress call from civilians under attack, we don't check territorial boundaries. We don't file diplomatic protests. We don't wait for permission." Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "We come in force, and we end the threat. You are outnumbered, human. 7 ships to 5. Math was never my strong point," Captain Chin replied conversationally. "But I did learn one important equation during my academy days. 1 human ship equals approximately 3 of yours. Want to test that theory?" Zektar cut the transmission and turned to his tactical officer. "Battle stations. All ships prepare for combat. These humans think their reputation will save them." Across the system, the human squadron was already moving into attack formation. Their ships accelerated with impossible speed, their engines burning bright against the starfield as they closed the distance with shocking rapidness. "Admiral, they're launching fighters," reported the sensor operator. "Estimated 60 small craft incoming. Launch our own fighters. All ships target their flagship. We'll show these Deathworlders what happens when they interfere in hegemony business." The space between the 2 fleets erupted into chaos as hundreds of small craft engaged in deadly aerial ballet. Hegemony fighters, sleek and efficient, found themselves matched against human pilots who flew with a reckless aggression that defied all tactical sense. Lieutenant Commander Torres, squadron leader of the Thunderstrike's fighter wing, rolled her craft through a barrage of plasma fire that would have vaporized most pilots. Her earpiece crackled with the voices of her pilots as they tore into the enemy formation. "Fox leader, I've got 3 bogeys on my 6, called Lieutenant Park. Break left and dive. Viper squadron will clean them up," Torres responded, simultaneously targeting a hegemony fighter that had made the mistake of crossing her path. Her particle cannons spoke with authority, turning the enemy craft into expanding debris. The human fighters moved like extensions of their pilot's will, performing maneuvers that pushed both machine and pilot to their absolute limits. They fought with the desperate fury of warriors protecting their own, except these warriors had chosen to protect an alien species they had never met. Meanwhile, the capital ships closed to engagement range. Admiral Zektar watched as his fleet's superior numbers began to tell. Human shields were taking damage, their formations showing signs of strain under the concentrated fire of 7 heavy cruisers. Target their engines, he ordered. Cripple them, and force surrender. But, as the hegemony ships focused their fire, something unexpected happened. The human ships didn't retreat or attempt to break off engagement. Instead, they pressed forward with even greater aggression, their weapons targeting specific weak points in hegemony ship design with surgical precision. Captain Chen's voice cut across all frequencies, broadcast in the clear for everyone to hear. All human ships, this is Thunderstrike Actual. Remember what we're fighting for. Remember who called for help. Remember that we are the line between predators and prey. The U.S. Defiant, smallest ship in the human squadron, had taken critical damage to its port side. Smoke poured from ruptured hull sections, and her captain reported engine failure on 2 of 3 main drives. Any reasonable commander would order withdrawal. Instead, Captain Morrison aimed his wounded ship directly at the nearest hegemony cruiser and pushed his remaining engine to maximum burn. "This is Defiant," he transmitted calmly. "We're going to ram that son of a bitch. All ships, continue the mission." Admiral Zektar watched in horror as the human ship accelerated toward his heavy cruiser dominant victory like a missile. At the last second, the Defiant's captain triggered his ship's self-destruct mechanism. The explosion vaporized both vessels instantly, sending shockwaves through the remaining hegemony fleet. "They're insane," whispered the tactical officer. But Zektar was beginning to understand something that chilled him to his core. The humans weren't fighting for territory or resources or political advantage. They were fighting for the principle that innocence should be protected, regardless of species or politics. And beings who fought for principles rather than profit were the most dangerous enemies imaginable. On the planet below, the Kithara huddled in their crystal shelters as the battle raged overhead. Their delicate, flower-like faces turned skyward as they watched the lights of combat streak across their atmosphere. They had sent their distress call without real hope of rescue, knowing that the galactic community typically ignored the plight of minor species. But somehow, impossibly, help had come. Fierce predators from the depths of space had heard their cry and responded with devastating force. Elder Kainina, leader of the largest surviving settlement, spoke softly to her people through their psychic connection. "The humans fight for us," she whispered, her mental voice filled with wonder. "They die for us, though they owe us nothing." The battle continued to rage, but the tide was turning. Human ferocity and tactical brilliance were overcoming hegemony numbers. Ship after ship fell to human weapons, their crews learning too late that reputation and reality were very different things when it came to Deathworlder military capabilities. The space around Refuge had become a graveyard of twisted metal and expanding plasma clouds. 3 hegemony heavy cruisers drifted as lifeless hulks, their crews either dead or evacuated. The remaining 4 vessels found themselves facing an enemy that fought with increasing fury rather than diminishing strength. Admiral Zektar stood on his damaged bridge, watching his tactical displays with growing desperation. The humans had lost only 1 ship, but that single loss seemed to have unleashed something primal in the surviving crews. They fought now not just with professional competence, but with the savage determination of pack hunters protecting their territory. "Admiral, the crushing Talon is requesting permission to withdraw," reported his communications officer. "They've lost primary weapons and main engines." Zektar's scaled fists clenched. In hegemony military doctrine, tactical withdrawal was not just acceptable, but encouraged when facing superior forces. But these humans would never let them retreat peacefully. They would pursue and harry his fleet until every ship was destroyed or captured. Denied. All ships maintain formation and concentrate fire on their flagship. On the bridge of the Thunderstrike, Captain Chun watched the enemy's desperate gambit unfold with cold professional interest. The hegemony ships were clustering together, trying to combine their firepower to overwhelm her ship's shields. It was a textbook maneuver that might have worked against any other species. "Captain, we're taking heavy fire from all remaining enemy vessels," reported Commander Hayes. "Shields at 60% and falling." "Good. Shin replied calmly. They're exactly where we want them. Signal the Relentless and Havoc. Execute pattern Delta 7. The two human ships that had been holding back suddenly burst into action, their engines flaring as they accelerated toward the clustered hegemony formation. They approached from above and below the orbital plane, their weapons trained on specific target points that their computers had identified through careful analysis of enemy shield frequencies. The hegemony ships found themselves caught in a three-dimensional crossfire as human weapons struck with devastating precision. Energy shields collapsed under coordinated bombardment, exposing vulnerable hull sections to follow-up strikes that penetrated deep into ship cores. Lieutenant Commander Torres led her fighter squadron through the chaos, her pilots weaving between capital ship weapons fire to strike at exposed weapons emplacements. Human fighters moved with predatory grace, their pilots pushing their craft beyond design limits in pursuit of tactical advantage. Torres to all fighters, she broadcast. Priority targets are their communications arrays. Cut them off from each other. The fighters swarmed over the hegemony ships like angry hornets, their weapons systematically destroying external sensors and communication equipment. Within minutes, the enemy fleet was effectively blind and deaf, unable to coordinate their defense or call for reinforcement. Admiral Zektar felt his ship shudder as human weapons found their mark. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across his bridge as secondary explosions echoed through the hull. His tactical displays flickered and died, leaving him to fight blind against enemies who seemed to anticipate his every move. Sir, we've lost communications with the rest of the fleet, his tactical officer reported. Hull breaches on decks 7 through 12. Casualty reports are. He paused, checking his displays. Severe, Admiral. A new voice cut through the static on the emergency channels. Captain Chin's words were broadcast on all frequencies, reaching every surviving crew member in the hegemony fleet. Attention, hegemony forces. This is your final warning. Surrender immediately and prepare to be boarded, or we will destroy every ship in your fleet. You have 60 seconds to respond. Zektar's pride warred with his survival instinct. The hegemony had never surrendered to an inferior force, and humans were supposed to be nothing more than primitive upstarts. But, looking around his devastated bridge, listening to the screams of his wounded crew, he began to understand why these particular upstarts had earned their fearsome reputation. Admiral, his communications officer said quietly, the Ruthless Conquest is requesting permission to surrender. Their captain reports 70% casualties and complete systems failure. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. Zektar could hear the sounds of his ship dying around him, the groan of stressed hull plates, the whisper of escaping atmosphere, the distant cries of damage control teams fighting to contain cascading failures. Sir, his first officer prompted. Zektar closed his eyes and made the hardest decision of his military career. Signal all ships. Cease fire and prepare for surrender. The space around refuge fell silent except for the crackle of cooling debris and the soft hum of human engines. On the Thunderstrike's bridge, Captain Chun allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction before turning to the business of securing her victory. Commander Hayes, deploy boarding parties to all enemy vessels. Full security protocols. I want their commanders in custody within the hour. Yes, ma'am. What about the wounded? Medical teams will accompany the boarding parties. We're not barbarians, despite what some aliens might think. The hegemony crews watched in stunned silence as human marines materialized on their ships. The boarders moved with deadly efficiency, securing critical systems and establishing control over each vessel. But, to the aliens' surprise, the first priority of every boarding team was providing medical aid to wounded crew members. Dr. Amanda Santos, Chief Medical Officer of the Thunderstrike, found herself treating a severely injured Draconian engineer whose breathing apparatus had been damaged in the battle. The alien looked up at her with reptilian eyes filled with confusion and fear. Why do you help me? He wheezed through his translator. I am your enemy. Dr. Santos continued her work without pausing, her hands moving with practiced precision as she repaired the damaged equipment. Because you're hurt, she replied simply. That's all that matters right now. The alien stared at her in bewilderment. In hegemony military doctrine, wounded enemies were left to die or used as leverage for negotiation. The concept of treating enemy casualties was so foreign that his translator struggled to find appropriate terms. Meanwhile, on the planet's surface, the Kithara emerged from their shelters to witness the aftermath of the battle. Their crystal cities lay in ruins, their beautiful gardens scorched by orbital bombardment. But they were alive, and, according to their observers in orbit, their attackers had been completely defeated. Elder Kainina stood in the ruins of the Grand Assembly, her delicate features etched with sorrow for what had been lost and gratitude for what had been saved. Around her, younger Kithara worked to tend the wounded and begin the process of rebuilding their civilization. Elder, one of her assistants said through their psychic link, "The humans are requesting permission to send down medical and engineering teams to assist with rescue operations." The elder considered this carefully. The Kithara had always been wary of military species, having learned through bitter experience that warriors rarely distinguished between enemies and allies when their blood was up. But these humans had just risked their lives to protect complete strangers, asking nothing in return except the chance to help. Grant permission, she decided, and extend our deepest gratitude for their sacrifice. The first human shuttles landed within hours, disgorging teams of doctors, engineers, and aid workers who immediately began coordinating with Kithara survivors. Captain Chun herself led one of the teams, her uniform traded for practical work clothes as she helped dig through rubble searching for survivors. The sight of the human captain, still bearing minor wounds from the space battle, working side by side with Kithara civilians sent shockwaves through the watching galaxy. News of the engagement had already reached major worlds, and diplomatic channels buzzed with commentary about human military intervention in hegemony territory. But, on Refuge, politics seemed irrelevant. Humans and Kithara worked together with growing mutual respect, the humans learning to appreciate alien engineering principles while the Kithara marveled at human determination and ingenuity. Captain Chun, Elder Kainina approached as the human officer supervised the construction of temporary shelters. "I must ask why your people came to our aid. We have nothing to offer you, no strategic value to your empire." Chun looked up from the refugee housing blueprint she had been reviewing, her dark eyes reflecting the alien elder's curiosity. "We don't have an empire, Elder, and we didn't come here for strategic value or trade agreements or political advantage." She gestured toward the combined human Kithara work teams. "We came because you called for help, and helping people who are in trouble is what humans do." The simplicity of the answer was somehow more profound than any complex diplomatic explanation. The elder found herself reconsidering everything she thought she knew about galactic politics and the nature of interspecies relations. As word of the battle spread throughout known space, reaction was swift and varied. Some species praised human intervention as necessary justice. Others condemned it as dangerous precedent. But among the scattered refugee populations and minor worlds that lived in constant fear of hegemony expansion, a new hope began to take root. The Deathworlders had shown that the hegemony could be beaten. More importantly, they had shown that some species would fight not for conquest, but for protection of the innocent. The galaxy would never be quite the same again. 3 days after the Battle of Refuge, the galactic political landscape erupted into chaos. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened on the neutral station of Harmony Prime, where representatives from dozens of species gathered to address what many were calling the most significant military action in recent galactic history. Ambassador Elena Vasquez of United Earth sat calmly at the human delegation table, reviewing her notes while alien politicians raged around her. The council chamber buzzed with a dozen different languages as species debated, argued, and occasionally threatened each other over the implications of human military intervention. The hegemony delegation, led by Supreme Chancellor Vox Thou, took the floor with obvious fury radiating from his crystalline form. "The humans have committed an act of unprovoked aggression against sovereign hegemony territory," he declared, his artificial voice carrying across the chamber. "This cannot be tolerated. We demand immediate sanctions and reparations." A chorus of voices responded, some supporting the hegemony's position, others challenging it. The ethereal collective's representative, a being of pure energy contained within a glowing sphere, spoke with musical tones that somehow conveyed skepticism. The evidence suggests that hegemony forces were engaged in the systematic extermination of civilian populations, the ethereal noted. Under Galactic Convention 847, any species has the right to intervene in cases of genocide. The Kithara refused hegemony protection. Voxthal shot back. They were in rebellion against lawful authority. Ambassador Vasquez rose slowly, her movement drawing attention from across the chamber. She was a small woman by human standards, but something in her bearing commanded respect even from species that towered over her. "May I address the council?" she asked politely. The chamber fell silent. Every alien present had heard rumors about human military capabilities, but few had actually seen humans in action. The Battle of Refuge had changed that, and now everyone wanted to understand what motivated these strange Deathworlders. "Honored representatives," Vasquez began, her voice calm and professional. "The hegemony claims that our forces committed an act of aggression. I would like to present the actual facts for council consideration." She activated her holographic display, showing recordings from the Thunderstrike sensors. The images were stark and undeniable. Hegemony ships systematically bombarding population centers, fighters hunting down civilian evacuation vessels, orbital weapons targeting hospitals and schools. These recordings show hegemony forces deliberately targeting non-combatant populations in clear violation of established galactic law, Vasquez continued. When our patrol squadron received distress calls from civilians under attack, they responded according to human military doctrine and galactic humanitarian principles. Chancellor Voxthal's crystalline form flashed with angry colors. "Your forces killed thousands of hegemony personnel." After offering them the opportunity to withdraw peacefully, Vasquez replied without emotion. Admiral Zektar chose to continue his bombardment of civilian targets rather than accept our terms. The responsibility for casualties lies with those who initiated hostilities against non-combatants. The debate that followed was intense, but predictable. The hegemony's client species supported their patron's position, while smaller independent worlds generally sided with humanity. The major galactic powers attempted to find middle ground that would satisfy their various political interests. But, while politicians argued, events were already spinning beyond their control. News of the Battle of Refuge had spread throughout the galaxy's communication networks, carrying with it something that hadn't existed before: proof that the hegemony could be defeated. On the mining world of Kepler Delta, a group of enslaved Zephyrian workers gathered in secret to discuss rumors they had heard from passing traders. The humans had not only defeated a hegemony fleet, but had stayed to help rebuild an alien world they had never seen before. The implications were staggering. "Do you think it's true?" asked Zeph Yen, a young worker whose people had been enslaved for 3 generations. "Could the Deathworlders really have beaten 7 heavy cruisers?" Elder Morthan, scarred from decades of forced labor, nodded slowly. "I heard the transmissions myself. The humans didn't just win. They completely destroyed the hegemony forces." He paused, looking around at the assembled workers. "And then, they stayed to help rebuild." The concept was so foreign to their experience that many found it difficult to believe. In their world, victory meant exploitation. Conquerors took what they wanted and left the defeated to suffer. But these humans seemed to operate by completely different principles. Similar conversations were taking place across hundreds of worlds. Species that had lived in fear of hegemony expansion began to whisper about the possibility of resistance. Trade unions started forming networks. Resistance cells shared information about human military doctrine and tactics. On Earth, Fleet Admiral Zhang Wei stood in the Terran Defense Force headquarters, reviewing intelligence reports from across the galaxy. The political fallout from Refuge was exactly what his analysts had predicted, but the social implications were beyond anything they had modeled. "Admiral," his intelligence chief said, approaching with a datapad, "we're receiving communication requests from 17 different resistance movements. They're asking for military support, weapons, training, everything except direct intervention." Zhang studied the reports carefully. Each request represented thousands, sometimes millions, of sentient beings living under hegemony oppression. The moral case for helping them was clear, but the political and military complications were staggering. "What's the assessment from strategic planning?" he asked. "They're split. Half the staff thinks we should maintain our current defensive posture and avoid further galactic entanglement. The other half believes we have a moral obligation to support legitimate resistance movements." The admiral set down the reports and walked to the massive viewing window that overlooked the orbital shipyards. Dozens of human warships were under construction, their hulls gleaming in Earth's reflected light. Each vessel represented humanity's commitment to defending their corner of the galaxy. But was that enough? Could they stand by while other species suffered under tyranny, knowing that they had the power to make a difference? His contemplation was interrupted by an aide's urgent announcement. "Admiral, priority communication from the refuge system. Captain Chun requests immediate conference." Zhang returned to his desk and activated the quantum communication array. Captain Chen's image materialized in the holographic display, her face showing the strain of the past week's events. "Admiral," she began without preamble, "I'm sending you a complete intelligence briefing on hegemony force dispositions in this sector. The data we recovered from their ships is extensive." "What's your assessment, Captain?" Chen's expression was grim, but determined. "Sir, they're planning something big. The attack on Refuge wasn't random aggression, it was a test. They've been probing the responses of various galactic powers, looking for signs of weakness or disunity. And our intervention has apparently convinced them that humans are a significant threat to their expansion plans. Intelligence suggests they're mobilizing a major fleet to teach us a lesson." Zhang absorbed this information with professional calm. But internally, he felt the familiar anticipation that preceded major military operations. If the hegemony wanted to test human resolve, they would discover that Deathworlders didn't back down from challenges. "Recommendations?" he asked. "We need to be proactive, sir. The hegemony respects only strength, and they interpret defensive posturing as weakness. If we wait for them to strike first, they'll choose the time and place of engagement." The admiral nodded slowly. Military logic supported Chen's assessment, but the political implications were staggering. Launching a preemptive strike against hegemony forces would effectively declare war on the galaxy's largest military power. "Captain, maintain your current position and prepare for possible reinforcement. I'll contact you with new orders within 12 hours. After ending the communication, Zhang sat alone in his office contemplating the choice before him. Humanity had spent decades trying to find its place in galactic civilization through diplomacy and trade. But the events at Refuge had demonstrated that sometimes the only language tyranny understood was applied force. His decision would determine not just humanity's future, but the fate of countless species across the galaxy. The Deathworlders had announced their presence with devastating effectiveness. Now they had to decide what they intended to do with the fear and hope they had inspired. Outside his window, the shipyards continued their work, human engineers and technicians preparing for a future that was no longer certain but filled with possibility. 6 months after the Battle of Refuge, the galaxy had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Human Defense Coalition now included 47 member species, ranging from the crystal farmers of Refuge to the deep space miners of the Outer Rim. What had begun as a single act of intervention had evolved into something unprecedented, a voluntary alliance based on mutual protection rather than conquest. Fleet Admiral Zhang Wei stood on the bridge of the UES Liberation, humanity's newest and most powerful dreadnought, as it led a fleet of 200 ships toward the hegemony's core territories. The vessels came from dozens of different worlds, their diverse designs united by a common purpose and the distinctive blue and silver markings of the coalition. The hegemony had responded to humanity's growing influence exactly as predicted, with overwhelming force. Their Grand Armada, 500 warships strong, was already deploying throughout the contested sectors, preparing to crush what their leadership called the Deathworlder Rebellion once and for all. "Admiral," reported Commander Singh from the tactical station. "Long-range sensors are picking up the enemy fleet. They're forming up around the Nexus system, exactly where our intelligence predicted." Zhang nodded grimly. The Nexus system contained the largest hegemony supply depot in this part of the galaxy, along with the regional command center that coordinated military operations across 17 sectors. If the coalition could take it, they would effectively cripple hegemony operations in the entire region. Signal all ships. Begin final approach. Remember, our primary objective is the liberation of the prison worlds. Everything else is secondary. The Coalition fleet advanced through space with predatory grace, their formation optimized for the kind of brutal close-quarters combat that humans had perfected over decades of warfare. At the fleet's heart flew ships crewed by species that had never been warriors but had learned to fight when their freedom depended on it. Captain Sarah Chun, now promoted to Commodore and commanding the assault group, watched her tactical displays with professional satisfaction. Her force included not just human ships, but vessels crewed by Kythera, Zephyrians, and a dozen other species who had answered the call to resist tyranny. Commodore, her communications officer reported, "We're receiving a transmission from the Hegemony fleet. Admiral Morgoth is demanding our immediate surrender." Chen's smile was cold enough to freeze hydrogen. "Put him through." The main screen filled with the image of a massive reptilian being whose scarred hide spoke of countless battles. Admiral Morgoth was the Hegemony's most feared military commander, responsible for the conquest of 30 star systems and the subjugation of billions of sentient beings. "Human," he growled, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You face the might of the Hegemony, Grand Armada. Surrender now, and your deaths will be swift. Continue this foolish resistance, and I will make your species extinct." "Admiral Morgoth," Chen replied with icy politeness. "I'm Commodore Sarah Chun of the Human Defense Coalition. Your forces are hereby ordered to stand down and release all civilian prisoners in this system. You have one opportunity to comply peacefully." The alien admiral's laughter was a sound like breaking stone. "You amuse me, Deathworlder. 500 ships against your pitiful 200. Even your reputation for savagery cannot overcome such odds." "You're probably right about the numbers," Chen conceded. "But you made one critical error in your calculations." "And what is that?" Chen's expression became absolutely lethal. "You assumed we came here to fight your ships. We didn't. We came here to free the prisoners you've been torturing for decades. Your fleet is just an obstacle to be removed." Before Morgoth could respond, the Coalition fleet erupted into action. But instead of engaging in the traditional capital ship duel that the Hegemony expected, they executed a maneuver that no military academy had ever taught. Controlled chaos designed to maximize psychological impact rather than tactical advantage. Human ships dove directly into the enemy formation with reckless abandon, their weapons targeting command and control centers rather than attempting to destroy opposing vessels. Alien Coalition members followed predetermined attack patterns that disrupted hegemony coordination while avoiding direct confrontation with superior firepower. The results were devastating. Within the first 10 minutes of combat, the Hegemony fleet found itself divided into isolated groups, their communications jammed, their command structure shattered by surgical strikes against flag officers and coordination centers. Admiral Morgoth watched in growing horror as his carefully planned formation disintegrated under an assault that made no tactical sense, but was brutally effective. His ships were more powerful individually, his crews better trained in traditional warfare, but the humans fought like rabid predators while their allies displayed a coordination that spoke of months of intensive preparation. "Admiral, we've lost contact with the 3rd and 7th battle groups," his tactical officer reported. "The humans have somehow infiltrated our communication frequencies." What the Hegemony didn't know was that their former prisoners had spent years learning every detail of their captors' military procedures. Zephyrian engineers who had been forced to maintain Hegemony equipment knew exactly which systems to target for maximum disruption. Kythera analysts who had been enslaved in intelligence centers understood Hegemony tactical doctrine better than most enemy officers. The Coalition wasn't just fighting the Hegemony. They were turning the enemy's own knowledge against them with surgical precision. On the bridge of the Liberation, Admiral Jean coordinated the overall battle with calm efficiency while monitoring reports from the surface assault teams. The real objective of the operation was already underway as human Marines and Coalition commandos fought their way through the prison complexes that housed millions of political prisoners and enslaved workers. "Admiral, surface teams report they've secured the main detention facility," his aide announced. "Prisoner evacuation is proceeding ahead of schedule." Zhang allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Each life saved justified the massive risk they were taking. The hegemony had turned the Nexus system into a showcase of their power, displaying the consequences of resistance for all the galaxy to see. Today, the coalition would demonstrate that even the mightiest tyrants could be humbled. The space battle continued to rage, but the tide was clearly turning. Hegemony ships began withdrawing in small groups, their commanders recognizing that their traditional tactics were useless against an enemy that refused to fight according to established conventions. Admiral Morgoth found himself virtually alone as his fleet scattered before the coalition advance. His flagship, the massive dreadnought Eternal Dominion, was surrounded by human vessels that attacked with the coordination of pack hunters. "This is impossible," he muttered, watching his tactical displays as another of his capital ships succumbed to concentrated human fire. "They're fighting like animals, not soldiers." His first officer, a veteran of dozens of campaigns, spoke quietly. "Admiral, perhaps that's exactly why they're winning. We've been fighting civilized wars against civilized opponents. These humans fight like the galaxy itself is at stake." The observation was more accurate than either alien realized. To humans, freedom wasn't a political concept to be negotiated. It was a fundamental principle worth dying for. They fought not just for victory, but for the right of every sentient being to determine their own destiny. As the last hegemony resistance collapsed, coalition ships began the massive task of evacuating liberated prisoners. Transport vessels from dozens of member worlds converged on Nexus, their crews working around the clock to provide medical aid and basic necessities to beings who had suffered under hegemony brutality for years. Commodore Chen stood on her bridge, watching the evacuation proceed with grim satisfaction. Around her, the debris of the once mighty hegemony fleet drifted silently through space. The message would spread quickly. The tyrants could be beaten, their victims could be freed, and the Deathworlders would come when called upon to defend the innocent. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Elder Kainina of Refuge approached Admiral Zhang during the victory celebration. The delicate alien leader carried with her a crystal tablet inscribed with symbols from every member species of the coalition. "Admiral Zhang," she said through her translator, "this is the Charter of Liberation, created by representatives of all coalition worlds. We offer it to humanity not as submission, but as recognition of your species' unique role in our shared struggle for freedom." Zhang accepted the tablet with appropriate ceremony, understanding the significance of the moment. Humanity had not sought to become the galaxy's protector, but circumstances had thrust that role upon them. The question now was whether they could live up to the responsibility. Looking out at the mixed fleet of coalition vessels, human ships flying alongside former enemies turned allies, he felt a sense of pride tempered by determination. The galaxy was vast, and tyranny had many forms. But as long as the Deathworlders heard the calls for help, no species would face oppression alone. The message that spread from Nexus reached every corner of known space within days. When the innocent called for aid, when the weak faced overwhelming odds, when tyranny seemed unstoppable, there would always be those willing to fight. The Deathworlders had made their choice, and the galaxy would never be the same. In the years that followed, historians would mark the Battle of Nexus as the beginning of the Great Liberation, the period when dozens of species threw off the chains of oppression and claimed their right to freedom. But for those who lived through it, the real victory was simpler. When help was needed, it came, no matter the cost or the odds. The galaxy had learned that sometimes the greatest strength came not from conquest, but from protection, not from fear, but from hope. And at the heart of that lesson stood the humans, the Deathworlders who had chosen to become guardians rather than conquerors, showing the universe that true power lay in defending those who could not defend themselves.